Harlem, New York. In September 1935, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was an established Harlem power broker, operating within the underground policy system that controlled much of the neighborhood's daily money flow. He worked quietly, carefully, and with discipline, moving through spaces where violence was common but restraint was rare. Harlem at that time was known for its energy and danger. It was a place where music, gambling, politics, and crime existed side by side. Nightclubs like the Cotton Club attracted wealthy white patrons, powerful gangsters, politicians, and celebrities, while the surrounding streets were controlled by local operators who depended on community trust to survive. Power in Harlem was contested, and control was never permanent. The environment rewarded intimidation, speed, and public displays of dominance. It punished hesitation, weakness, and anyone who allowed themselves to be disrespected without response. Reputation mattered as much as money. A single public moment could decide whether a man was feared, ignored, or targeted. At this time, Bumpy Johnson was one of the last independent black operators in Harlem who had not been forced out or absorbed by white criminal organizations. He understood that survival depended not just on force, but on patience, planning, and respect. Harlem was not governed only by guns. It was governed by memory, loyalty, and consequence. By the mid-1930s, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as a serious and disciplined figure in Harlem's criminal world. He was not loud, not reckless, and not prone to public displays. His influence came from organization and from the quiet confidence that others recognized and feared. A former street operator who had survived years of arrests, rivalries, and violent pressure, Johnson carried himself with calm control. He spoke little, watched carefully, and never reacted in public without purpose. Those who dealt with him understood that silence did not mean submission. It meant calculation. Among Harlem's black policy operators, Johnson represented stability and protection in a system dominated by white gangsters with more money, more political connections, and greater access to weapons. While others had been driven out, bribed, or destroyed, Johnson remained. He adapted instead of confronting power directly. To his community, he symbolized resistance without chaos. He was proof that control could be maintained without constant violence, and that patience could be mistaken for weakness only once. In a world where disrespect was often fatal, Bumpy Johnson allowed insults to pass, until the moment they no longer could. But not everyone respected Bumpy Johnson. One figure in particular, Dutch Schultz, represented a growing and dangerous force in Harlem. Schultz was not from the neighborhood, but he believed Harlem could be taken the same way other territories had been taken before him, through money, fear, and pressure applied without hesitation. Schultz was a powerful bootlegger and criminal boss, known for violence, intimidation, and ruthless expansion. His organization generated millions of dollars each year, and he used that wealth to buy protection, weapons, and political cover. He had forced other black operators out of business, driven some into retirement, and destroyed others who resisted him. Schultz believed that power belonged naturally to men like himself. He believed white gangsters could enter black neighborhoods, take control, and face no lasting resistance. In his view, black operators existed only because white criminals allowed it. Any challenge to that belief was, to him, an insult that needed to be crushed publicly. He had learned that threats worked, violence worked, and when those methods were used openly and repeatedly without serious consequences, they created confidence. Schultz came to believe that no one in Harlem could truly stop him. Dutch Schultz continued his behavior by exploiting weaknesses in the system around him. Law enforcement was uneven, often corrupt, and focused on larger political concerns rather than daily violence in Harlem. Criminal operations continued as long as they did not disrupt the balance of power downtown. Authority tolerated Schultz's actions because he had money, connections, and influence. He paid when necessary, he threatened when useful, and he understood how to operate just below the level that forced serious intervention. When people were beaten or killed, investigations moved slowly or quietly disappeared. At the same time, Schultz used fear to isolate his opponents. Witnesses were afraid to speak. Victims' families were powerless. Each successful act of violence reinforced the idea that resistance was pointless. His collectors and enforcers moved openly through Harlem, confident they would not be stopped. Over time, this lack of consequences shaped Schultz's behavior. He stopped seeing Harlem as a place with limits. He stopped believing that respect mattered. Public insults, racial slurs, and open humiliation became tools instead of risks. By 1935, Dutch Schultz believed himself untouchable. He believed no black gangster could challenge him openly and survive. That belief would shape his choices, and those choices would soon bring consequences he did not expect. The first incident did not happen in public, and it did not involve shouting or violence. It occurred during routine business in Harlem, as Dutch Schultz's collectors began moving through policy routes that had long been controlled by local operators. They demanded payments, replaced familiar faces with outsiders, and spoke to people as if the neighborhood already belonged to them. There was no direct threat made to Bumpy Johnson at that time. No message was sent. No meeting was requested. Schultz's men simply acted as if Johnson did not matter. As if his presence, his history, and his influence could be ignored. Johnson noticed. He heard the reports. He understood what was happening. But he did not respond. He did not confront the collectors. He did not order retaliation. He allowed the moment to pass. To many observers, this looked like weakness. Harlem had seen other men pushed aside in the same way, slowly erased without a fight. Silence was often the first sign that a man was finished. Those close to Bumpy Johnson expected action. They expected him to push back, to send a warning, or to remind Schultz that Harlem was not empty ground. Some believed that allowing the insult to stand would invite more pressure and more disrespect. But Johnson's restraint was deliberate. Those who understood the environment knew that patience was not surrender. It was preparation. Johnson was not ignoring the insult. He was measuring it. He was allowing Schultz to reveal how far he was willing to go, and how careless he had become. In Harlem, fast reactions often led to fast deaths. Men who struck too early exposed themselves. Johnson chose to wait, knowing that the system rewarded those who acted only when the moment could not be reversed. What looked like weakness to outsiders was, to those who knew him, the beginning of something far more dangerous. The next incident occurred weeks later, during regular collections in central Harlem. Schultz's men replaced local runners with their own people and openly redirected money that once flowed through Harlem operators. The change was deliberate and visible. This time, the provocation was worse. Collectors spoke openly about Schultz owning Harlem. They mocked local operators and dismissed complaints. They acted as if resistance no longer existed. Again, Bumpy Johnson remained restrained. He did not interfere. He did not respond with threats. He allowed the change to stand. Each incident increased Schultz's confidence. Each day without response reinforced his belief that Johnson was unwilling or unable to act. The next incident followed shortly after, at a neighborhood policy bank. Schultz's men forced the operator to close and replaced him with an outsider. The closure disrupted income for local families who depended on the operation. This provocation was worse because it damaged trust within the community. It showed disregard not only for Johnson, but for Harlem itself. Again, Johnson did nothing publicly. He watched and waited. Schultz interpreted the silence as submission. His men grew bolder. They moved without fear, convinced that Harlem had already fallen. Another incident occurred soon after, when a longtime Harlem operator was beaten for resisting Schultz's demands. The beating was public enough to be known, but quiet enough to avoid attention from authorities. Once again, Johnson remained still. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. Schultz no longer measured his actions. He believed the pattern was clear. Each unchallenged move convinced him that no consequence would follow. Everything changed when the conflict became public. The line was crossed at the Cotton Club, in front of more than 200 witnesses. Dutch Schultz did not speak through intermediaries. He did not keep the matter private. He chose public humiliation. He shouted racial insults at Bumpy Johnson, questioning his status, his intelligence, and his right to exist as an equal in the criminal world. He did it loudly, deliberately, and without restraint. This incident crossed a line because it was no longer business. It was no longer territory or money. It was a public declaration that disrespect would carry no cost. Authority response was minimal. No one intervened. No one stopped Schultz. The moment passed without consequence. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. In that environment, public disrespect demanded response. Silence was no longer strategy. It would now mean acceptance. And acceptance would erase everything Johnson represented. What followed was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was the result of patience meeting a final boundary. The decision had already been made. That evening, after leaving the Cotton Club, Bumpy Johnson spoke quietly to the men closest to him. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He did not threaten anyone directly. His words were calm and measured, spoken as statements rather than warnings. He explained that a line had been crossed. He said that public disrespect could not be ignored, because ignoring it would invite more of the same. He made it clear that what followed would not be random or emotional, but deliberate. Johnson told them that actions would now speak in his place. He said that the response would be controlled, limited, and final. There would be no public arguing and no negotiation. Those who heard him understood the meaning. They had worked with him long enough to recognize the tone. When Johnson spoke this way, decisions had already been made. There would be no reversal. Nothing else needed to be said. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. Harlem continued its routines. People went to work. Nightclubs stayed open. Policy collections continued. Streets filled with noise and movement as they always had. There were no visible signs that anything had changed. Schultz's men moved as usual, still confident, still unafraid. The city did not slow down or prepare. This contrast made what followed unforgettable. What came next did not arrive with chaos or warning. It arrived quietly, inside the normal rhythm of the city. And because of that, it could not be dismissed or forgotten. The response was already in motion. Dutch Schultz escalated publicly. The moment took place inside the Cotton Club on a crowded Monday night. The club was full. Music was playing. Drinks were flowing. People from different worlds shared the same room. Wealthy patrons, politicians, gangsters, and performers. It was a place where appearances mattered and where reputation was everything. Schultz had been drinking, but this was not a drunken mistake. Witnesses later said his actions were deliberate. He stood up from his table near the stage and walked across the room with purpose. His body language drew attention. Conversations stopped as people sensed trouble approaching. He stopped at Bumpy Johnson's table. Schultz did not speak quietly. He did not try to keep the moment private. He slammed his hand down and spoke loudly, using racial insults and language meant to degrade and humiliate. He questioned Johnson's intelligence. He questioned his right to operate in Harlem. He made sure everyone in the room heard him. This time there was no ambiguity. Schultz was not talking about business. He was not negotiating territory. He was declaring dominance. He was making it clear that he believed Johnson was beneath him, and that no response would matter. The room went silent. People understood that this moment could not be undone. In this environment, public disrespect was not a mistake. It was a challenge, and challenges demanded answers. Bumpy Johnson did not react immediately. He remained seated. He looked up calmly. His face showed no anger, no fear, no surprise. He allowed Schultz to finish speaking. That pause mattered. It showed control. Then Johnson stood. The movement was slow and deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He did not return insults. He spoke clearly and quietly, but his words carried through the room. He told Schultz to remove his people from Harlem within 7 days. He explained that if this did not happen, Schultz's men would begin to die. Not arrested, not beaten, dead. One by one. There was no emotion in Johnson's voice. Only certainty. Schultz laughed. He mocked the warning. He treated it as a joke. He believed Johnson was bluffing. He believed that public humiliation had ended the conflict. He did not understand that the conflict had just entered its final stage. According to witnesses, Everything that followed happened with speed and precision. There were no public announcements, no claims of responsibility, no dramatic displays. What happened next unfolded quietly, inside ordinary routines. Less than 7 hours after the confrontation, the first body was discovered. The man was one of Schultz's key operators in Harlem. His role was essential. His death was not random. It was planned. The location where his body was found ensured it would be discovered quickly. A note was left behind. The message was clear and direct. The warning had not been empty. Each day that followed, another man died. The killings did not happen in the same way, but the pattern remained consistent. Each target was part of Schultz's Harlem operation. Each death occurred within a controlled window of time. Each body carried a message. There was no chaos. There were no mistakes. Movements were precise. Surveillance had already been done. Routines had already been studied. Each man was taken when he was most vulnerable. Each action ended before help could arrive. Law enforcement responded after the fact. Bodies were found. Notes were read. But there was no immediate intervention that could stop what was happening. The pace was too fast. The planning too careful. Schultz reacted with anger and fear. He ordered his men to find Johnson. He offered money for information. He made threats. But Johnson could not be found. He had disappeared completely. As the days passed, confidence turned into panic. By the third death, Schultz understood the seriousness of the situation. By the fifth, his remaining men were afraid to leave their homes. By the seventh, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The final death came quietly, like the others. No speech, no warning, just confirmation. Before meaningful intervention was possible, the outcome had already been decided. Schultz withdrew from Harlem. His operations shut down. His men were pulled out. 18 months of expansion ended in 1 week. The violence had been brief, controlled, limited. It stopped exactly where Johnson had said it would stop. The message did not need repeating. In environments like this, decisive action replaces argument. Once the line was crossed, restraint ended. And once the response began, it did not stop until the lesson was complete. The city remembered, and those who witnessed it understood that patience, when mistaken for weakness, can become the most dangerous force of all. After the final death, the violence stopped. Bumpy Johnson did not continue. He did not expand the conflict. He did not take advantage of fear to push further. The message had been delivered, and he allowed events to settle. He did not hide forever. He did not flee the city. When attention turned toward him, he did not resist it. Johnson returned to Harlem openly. He walked the same streets he had always walked. He met people face to face. There were no guards surrounding him and no signs of panic. His calm presence made it clear that his actions had been intentional and complete. When questioned by authorities, he did not argue. He did not boast. He did not confess. He answered only what was required and nothing more. There was no attempt to dramatize what had happened. Before being removed from the scene and taken away, Johnson spoke a single line to those nearby. It was not a threat. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. He said that Harlem protects its own, and that choices always have consequences. Nothing else needed to be said. The conflict was over. Dutch Schultz survived the conflict, but he did not survive it unchanged. When the final message reached him, the meaning was clear. 8 men were dead. Each had been part of his Harlem operation. Each death followed the warning exactly. There was no confusion about who was responsible or why it had happened. Schultz shut down his Harlem operations. Collectors were pulled out. Policy banks were closed. Enforcers were reassigned or told to disappear. What had taken him more than a year to build was abandoned in a matter of days. He did not make speeches. He did not issue threats. He did not attempt revenge inside Harlem. He understood that the cost of continuing would only increase. Survival required withdrawal. Although Schultz lived, the loss followed him. His reputation suffered. Other gangsters began to see him differently. He was no longer the man who could push anywhere without consequence. He had misjudged the environment and everyone knew it. Across Harlem, behavior changed. White gangsters who still operated near black neighborhoods became careful. They avoided public insults. They avoided loud displays of power. Meetings became quieter. Words were chosen more carefully than before. Black operators also understood what had happened. The outcome showed that restraint, when paired with resolve, could shift power. It showed that control did not require constant violence, only the certainty that violence would follow if boundaries were crossed. The message required no repetition. No announcements were made. No explanations were needed. The story spread on its own, carried by memory and fear. Everyone knew the timeline. Everyone knew the cause. Everyone knew the result. Harlem returned to routine life. Music continued. Business continued. But the balance beneath it all had changed. Respect was no longer assumed. It had become necessary. When authorities and observers later reviewed what had happened, a clear structure appeared. The conflict did not begin with violence. It began with escalation. Schultz expanded slowly, pushing further each time he faced no resistance. Each success made the next move easier. Each unanswered provocation increased his confidence. Then came the warnings. Johnson did not respond immediately. He allowed time. He allowed behavior to continue. But when the final insult came, the warning was public, direct, and specific. A deadline was given. Conditions were stated clearly. There was no confusion about what would happen next. System failure followed. Public humiliation took place without intervention. Authority did not act. The environment allowed the conflict to move forward without limits. In that absence of restraint, responsibility shifted away from institutions and onto individuals. What followed matched the warning exactly. Targets were limited. Violence was controlled. There were no unnecessary deaths. The actions stopped when the stated goal was achieved. That discipline mattered to those who studied the case afterward. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Escalation led to warning. Warning was ignored. System failure removed alternatives. The response followed with precision. The conclusion was unavoidable. This was not random violence. It was not emotional revenge. It was the result of repeated choices made in an environment where respect functioned as law. When the system failed to enforce boundaries, someone else did. And once those boundaries were restored, the violence stopped. The case became a lesson not because of how long it lasted, but because of how clearly it followed its own rules. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate. It moved quietly through Harlem at first. It was spoken in barbershops, back rooms, and private meetings. It was not told loudly, and it was not exaggerated. People did not need to embellish it. The facts alone were enough. The story survived because it explained something important. It explained what happened when patience was misunderstood. It explained what followed when public disrespect was allowed to stand. And it explained how quickly balance could shift once a boundary was crossed. The incident was remembered not for spectacle, but for discipline. Those who studied it noticed how controlled everything had been. The warning was clear. The response matched the warning exactly. And when the objective was reached, the violence stopped. That restraint mattered. It showed that the purpose was not chaos, but correction. Over time, the story spread beyond Harlem. Other neighborhoods heard it. Other operators learned from it. The details were not always the same, but the lesson remained intact. Public insults were avoided. Conflicts were handled privately. Men who once relied on fear alone began to measure their words. The story became a quiet reference point. No one needed to say the names out loud. A single sentence was often enough. Remember Harlem. Everyone understood what that meant. In places like this, reputation is currency. Once it is damaged, it cannot be repaired easily. The incident showed that respect could not be taken without cost. It had to be maintained, even between enemies. Authority did not deliver that lesson. Institutions did not enforce it. The environment taught it to itself. That is why the story lasted. It was not about one man winning or losing. It was about how systems behave when they fail, and how individuals respond when left with no alternatives. It showed that patience is powerful, but only until it is abused. Generations later, the meaning remained clear. In places like this, restraint is noticed, silence is measured, and when a line is crossed, the response is remembered far longer than the insult that caused it. In worlds governed by respect, the price of misunderstanding silence is always paid in full.